together. Unity is the answer. This world is getting smaller. We have to unite if we must survive. Unity is what would keep us alive. Nothing else. Let us protect ourselves. What we need is one Caribbean. We need one Caribbean. We have too many borders, too many flags, too many passports, too much immigration. All we need is one Caribbean. We need one Caribbean. Must understand this. We need much more than simple lip service. Let us pool the resources that we got so we become more than just little dots in this world. The mighty control. What we need is one. We need one Caribbean. We need one, only one. We need one Caribbean. We have too many borders. Oh God, too many flags. Too many passports, too much immigration, when all we need is one. We need one Caribbean. We need one, only one Caribbean. Whose land is bigger or which is smaller. In a disaster, that doesn't matter. Mistake has long dictated. The time is now when we cooperate. Can't we see? We need unity. All we need is one Caribbean. We need one, only one Caribbean. We have too many borders, too many flags, too many passports, too much immigration. All we need is one Caribbean. We need one, only one Caribbean. Independence is still on paper. We are still controlled by some foreign master, to whose drum we dance when his music played. This unity is what have us this way. That is wrong when we could be strong. If we just have one Caribbean, only one, just one Caribbean. We have too many borders, too many flags, too many passports, too much immigration. All we need is one Caribbean. We need one, only one Caribbean. Tell your preacher, tell your teacher, one Caribbean. We need one, only one Caribbean. Tell your leader, one Caribbean. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Jumba. If I like, ask Kamal about the bacchanal down at the convention when Ivan asked Williams, Doc, why Venezuela don't want me to smelter? Doctor, can you tell me why Jamaica vex with me? Eric say, tell Manley and Burnham I've got oil. let Barrow kiss me tail. Oil don't spoil. 3 of them come like 3 blind mice. Don't you know? Manly, Burnham, Barrow. They're running about only setting strife, cutting their tails with Venezuela's knife. Did you ever see such jackasses in your life as them 3 blind mice? Ivan said, look, doctor, didn't you ask Venezuela for warships to help we in the 70 mutiny? From Barrow we get rum, from Manly aluminum, Burnham feeding we with rice, yet you calling him a blind mice. Eric said, let Burnham keep he rice, I've got oil, they will have to pay my price. Oil don't spoil. 3 of them come like 3 mice. Don't you know? Burnham, Barrow. I treat them like if they were my wife. I give them money like peas by Christ, but it's my own throat they're trying to slice. Them 3 blind mice. So true.
This is very good.
Them 3 mice do not know is I have them on the toe. Food for them to be fed. Without me, all of them dead. Is my people have to toil to give them pitch and oil. Yet they back in Venezuela and don't want my land to smelter. Eric say, they value my money as dirt, but I've got oil. 80 cents they say it is worth, but oil don't spoil. They remind me of them 3 blind mice. Don't you know? Manly, Burnham, Barrow. For beg me again for what I have, but this time I'm going to make them starve. To get my dollars, the best thing twice. Them 3 blind mice. If I lie, ask Smiley. Both of us met Manly, traveling from St. Lucia. We met him in Grenada. I told him what the doc say. Manly blurt out right away. Tell Eric he has not died, for he has blind men at his side. Manly said, them 3 deputies that he have is the oil. 3 spineless men of straw have been spoiled. 3 of them come like 3 blind. Manly call, Kamal Chambers error. Anything the doc say is right for them. The 3 of them are really yes men. Did you ever see such rat-tailed men in your life as them 3 blind mice?
The action is now over. A hard and at times bitter campaign has come to an end. On the results, the People's National Congress, in the interests of peace and stability in Guyana, has agreed with the support of the United Force to form the government. One of the more serious tasks facing us at this moment is the attainment of independence at the earliest point of time. One of the disturbing features of the election, which we have noted, is the apparent cleavage existing in our society, brought about by colonialism and 7 years of mismanagement and misrule. It has come to our knowledge that despite the years of disaster suffered by the people of this country, a large section of the electorate was persuaded of its interests to vote for the party formerly in power as a result of the dishonest and opportunist propaganda that, unless that party was returned to power, those people would suffer. The new government, headed by me, intends to show by its actions in the immediate future, and indeed throughout its term of office, that this is not true. The problem of racial cleavage, racial antagonism, and distrust, which the last government allowed to develop during its term of office, is still with us. But our government recognizes this as a challenge which it intends to accept and which it is determined to overcome. My government considers that it is a matter of the greatest importance and the utmost urgency that an atmosphere of relaxation be established immediately. The reduction of tension, which is already apparent and which will become more pronounced every passing day, when it is realized that not only are we intent on being fair and just, but also that we have at our disposal the means to carry out our intention, is merely the first fruits of our attainment of office. Enemies of this country would like to see racial division and antagonism continue. They will not have that satisfaction. The government recognizes that its duty is to rule in the interests of all the people of this country. It will dispel the fears of the apprehensive and confound the hopes of those who seek the destruction of this country. To be specific, this government holds that all the people of this country are equally important, whether they belong to a large group or to a small group. To us, the Amerindians are important. To us, the Chinese are important. To us, the Portuguese are important. To us, the Europeans are important. To us, the mixed races are important. To us, the Africans are important. To us, the Indians are important. In short, all Guyanese are important and valued members of our community, and we cherish them and consider that as a government, it is our duty and privilege to guard, protect, and further the real interests of all. It would appear that the would-be destroyers of this country have sought to convince our Indian citizens that they have cause to fear because of the removal of the former government. We can assure our Indian citizens here and now that rather than cause for fear, they have much to hope for from the new government. This government is not bent on the confiscation of property. This government will not pursue policies likely to bring the races into collision. This government will maintain law and order. This government, while in office, will never declare its impotence to see that the lives and property and personal safety of any citizens are protected. We are fully aware that attempts will be made in the future, as in the past, to create disturbances. All of us know who are likely to create disturbances and who think that they have some benefit to be derived from chaos and violence. We have no benefit to derive from such things, and we will stamp out firmly and ruthlessly any disruption of the calm and steady progress which we are determined to establish and maintain in this country for the good of all. We ask for time, patience, understanding. The damage done over the last 7 years cannot be repaired in a day. We cannot and will not condone and accept the nepotism and corruption of the past 7 years. Changes are necessary, and changes will be made. But no one who is honest and possessed of ability need have the least apprehension. The results of the election and the formation of our government are not to be considered a victory for one party, but a triumph for the whole Guyanese people. There is nothing to gloat over. Nobody is pant-up. But all of us are, I am sure, sobered by the realization of how near we came to having our country destroyed, and how arduous were our endeavors to give this country the chance to live, to breathe, to survive. It has been reported to me that some established organizations have made representations to the British government about Guyanese affairs. I wish to announce that in the future, I shall seek to hold discussions with the Mahasabha, the Hindu organization, the United Sadr Islamic Anjuman, ASCRIA, GAIL, the Chinese Association, and of course with the Archbishop of the West Indies, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Georgetown, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Congregational Conference, the Methodist Body, and other religious and cultural organizations. My purpose as Premier is to establish a consultative democracy. And now that the majority of the Guyanese electorate has declared in favor of the government in power, it is my wish that Guyanese in and out of the legislature, with malice towards none and goodwill towards all, will settle down to the engaging task of binding up the nation's wounds and charting a new course, a new road of peace and prosperity for Guyana.
The unmistakable voice of Lyndon Forbes Burnham, speaking there in 1964, 62 years ago, as his coalition government of the PNC and the then United Force was preparing to take office. 2 nights ago, I was asked to speak at the book launch for one of my comrades, Moses Bagwan. And I sought to tell the audience, from my perspective, that I view Bagwan's book as a particular perspective in a plural society. That in a plural society, there are going to be plural perspectives and the plural narratives. I made reference to the split in 1955 that ultimately produced the PPP and the PNC as 2 polar perspectives and worldviews on how Guyana is going to proceed. And then there was another split in 1956, when Guyana, Martin Carter, Rory Westmus, and Lionel Jeffrey, and Keith Carter, and others left the PPP in what Jagan dubbed the ultra-left split. And my argument is that split, that second split, is important because it opened up a new political space that would eventually give rise to the WPA, and later on parties like the AFC would drink from that well because that space was opened up. I called it the independent space. It may not be an apt description, but the point I was trying to make is that in our plural society, there's no single story. There's no one story. That is why some people instinctively reject the one Guyana nonsense that this government is trying to promote. But I wanted to impress that because I think in societies like ours, we tend to reach for the homogeneous, even if it means silencing the heterogeneous. It's one of the challenges of nation building in a plural society. And it is my own view that over time, after 60, 70, 80 years of decolonization and independence, that dilemma is still with us. I read Clement Rohi's autobiography. I read Bagwan's autobiography. They're telling the same story of the same time, but you wouldn't believe that these two people are talking about the same thing. And nothing is necessarily wrong with that. Nothing is necessarily wrong with that. And so as I was driving home, I thought, I said, you know what? Let me do a program on Burnham. Let me do a program on Burnham. Because we live in a time, the time of social media, that things are moving quickly. Information is moving very quickly, rapidly. And what we call the past is really yesterday or the day before. What about 40 years ago? That there's a danger in developing a society which is not aware of its own past. And even when it's aware of its past, it wants to superimpose that past as the only narrative of the past of the country. It's dangerous either way. And so I thought, having listened to this independent narrative that people like Moses Bagwan and Guyana and so on represent, I think it's only fair to hear the perspective from the Burnham side. If the Bagwans and the Guyana were talking about the independence project as oppositionists, as something that goes beyond state and statecraft. To understand Burnham, we have to situate Burnham, or anybody, but we're talking about Burnham tonight. We have to situate Burnham within the context of statecraft. Neither Bagwan nor Guyana led the government of the country. They had ideas. They served close to government, but they did not serve in government. And so I think if we want to make sense of our country, we have to come at Burnham within the context of statecraft. And I think often that's lost on Burnham people. It's lost on Jagan people. It's lost on Guyana people. To also understand Burnham, we have to understand him within the context of his time. He died in 1985, a mere 19-year independence, still in the early years of independence. And the dynamics of the early years of independence, and 60 years later, while there are similarities, there are also profound differences. And so I want tonight to, I'm tempted to say begin this conversation, but I don't think it's beginning. To broaden this conversation in an understanding of Guyana. And at the time of independence, I talked about Jagan's exhortation, workers of the world, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Burnham talking about the destiny to mold, and Guyana, this confounded nonsense must stop. And I proffered at the time that to understand and to tease out the complexity of our Guyana and our Caribbean from our perspective as Guyanese, we need to read them separately and together, because they're dealing with the same phenomenon: decolonization, independence, and post-colonization. But they expose different attitudes because they're coming from different places. Jagan is coming from an international communist place. Guyana is coming from a grassroots radical place of speaking back to white authority. Do not tell me in 1953 how to run my government. And Burnham is talking about the destiny to mold from the perspective of nation building from the state. And I think if we can find the courage to sift through that milieu, only then we are going to get somewhere. I listened to a few clips today as I prepared for the program on Burnham, and I had to decide on one to play. And I decided to play that one from 1964, which is where I, in a sense, want to begin this conversation. It is perhaps what I would call Burnham's thesis on race and ethnicity in Guyana. His thesis. From the little clips that I saw online and so forth, I don't think he ever went in such a profound way in an analysis of race and ethnicity. And the reason I want to start there is because when I look at Burnham's party today, in a sense, it's a party that is afraid to go where Burnham went there in 1964. And my frustration, because the PPP is not afraid to go there, neither the past PPP nor the present PPP. The independent strand, the Guyanas and so on, have never been afraid to go there. But there's something about the present PNC that is afraid to confront the problem of race and ethnicity. Burnham, of course, is a statesman. And he's saying that we are going to beat this thing. But that was not. All right, here we are. It seems to be getting some static here tonight, but I think we are back. So I was saying that I wanted to begin our conversation about Burnham tonight from that perspective, because I think there is something to be learned there. The casual researcher looking at how the PNC deals with the question of race and ethnicity would want to conclude that Burnham did not deal with the issue. And so I played that to really say that Burnham did have more than a perspective on race and ethnicity, that he had an appreciation that it was a fundamental problem, that he dedicated his government from the standpoint of government, how to deal with it. I have here tonight Vincent to this program. I have a lecturer at the University of Guyana, Dwayne Benjamin, and we're expecting young Kibwe Copeland, who is the chairman of the Burnham Foundation, to join us later. So it's one of those conversations that sometimes it's difficult, but we have to have them. And, you know, I want to, my friend Turkey, who's a PNC member, who remonstrated with me the other night and said, man, you talking too much about the past and history. Nobody want to know about Moses back one and all them kind of things. Me want to know what happened now. So I dedicate tonight's program to my friend Turkey, because I think it's a necessary conversation, and I think sometimes we underestimate Dwayne and Vincent, where our people are in terms of their gazes and what they're looking for. On my Politics 101 program, the clip that has the largest viewership, 500,000, was a program that I did with Dwayne and Vincent. Ipadaji did that program on books, and a clip from How Europe Underdeveloped Africa that I was reviewing has 500,000 views, followed by my discussion of the origins of the word Douglas. 281,000 views, followed by Shama Solomon, one of his letters on Son Chapman, 161,000 views. I think sometimes we underestimate our people's interest in these issues. And so I thought, for all of those reasons, that we have to talk about Burnham. We have to talk about Burnham. And I didn't want to bring on people who critique Burnham, because there's a kind of predictability there. Not that the critique of Burnham is not valid. It is valid, because the independent strand that I talk about, in a sense, is a critique of the status narrative in our midst. And I wanted to bring on people who know about Burnham, because I think that is always very important, because there are people who like Burnham, chat about Burnham, but don't know much about Burnham beyond that he was their great leader and they love him and so forth. But I wanted this discussion to go and to start from a place of informed discussion. Even if biased, as it must be, but informed. Informed and biased takes you to a different place from when you are biased and uninformed. Vincent and Dwayne, welcome. I hope you all are a little bit tolerant of my long introduction, but I hope to set the tone for what we are going to talk about. Vincent, let me start with you. And you must have listened to that Burnham speech in 1964 several times. But as you listen to it tonight, and Dwayne, I'm giving you time to oil up your your gears, because you are coming next on that question. But Vincent, as you listen Burnham, that clip tonight, what goes through your mind?
Well, clearly, I may have a predetermined position on that speech, but that speech, for all intents and purposes, signals Burnham's recognition that he was dealing with a plural society, and that in dealing with that plural society, from the standpoint of government, he had to be concerned about the interests of all of the segments of that society, and how he can pull them together in a manner that provided for nation building. Because we're starting off, and this is what a lot of people do not understand, that because of the plurality of our society, we are not naturally a nation, and that most have become a nation state, where the oneness has to do with the way in which our laws address us as equals, and our institutions address us as equals, but that in fact, we are not necessarily equals from the standpoint of our individual histories and the histories of our peoples, and how they came, and the circumstances under which they have existed. And so, recognizing that, he was very, very conscious and knew that he had to address this question of our diversity, but our desire at the same time to fulfill that aspiration of the motto, one people, one nation, one destiny. And I think it is important for us in that circumstance to see the motto not as what was, but what was being aspired to. And if you see what is being aspired to, and you recognize the plurality, you can see that he had to recognize that plurality and seek to put in place institutions that did two things. One, not to interfere with diversity, because it's a question of human rights, but at the same time, to see how one could treat that diversity in a manner that lend to cohesion and lend to nation building.
Cohesion and nation building. I am tempted to do a follow-up with you, Vincent, but I'm going to come back to you in short order. Let me go to Brother Dwayne. Dwayne, you were born long after that speech was made. And so in a sense, as an activist, as an educationist, you are listening to that speech. What are your thoughts? What goes through your mind?
All right, thank you very much, Professor Hines, and good night to your audience. Thanks for having me here. Now, to respond to your question, I think I am almost in the same vein as Mr. Alexander in terms of where the speech is coming from and what the intention was. And I would go a bit more, because if we go back to the history leading up to that speech, it identified a particular problem. And the problem was basically a divide at independence. Guyana was very much a divided society. It required basically a coalition government in the PNC and the United Force. And much to well, of course, the PPP would have lost out in that arrangement. But the point is that what the intention of the government as implied by the speech is that there must be a holistic approach to nation building, one that involves and incorporates the almost every single group in the society, the Africans, the Chinese, the East Indians, and the other group. So that the recurrent theme of that, outside the nation building and social cohesion, had more to do with achieving national unity. But if we go beyond that and see what was done following that speech, a lot of the policies basically were geared towards achieving some of those very objectives.
But we're going to get there in time. Mm-hmm. We're going to get there in time. I'm going to come back to you with policies later on. Vincent, I'm coming to you because you were there at the book launch on Saturday night.
Yeah.
And basically, the people at that book launch were of a certain, most of us were of a certain political, not affiliation, but of a certain political complexion, for want of a better term. We are all people who were around the WPA, in the WPA, and so forth. And it's all well and good. But what Burnham was dealing with in that speech, Sidney King dealt with it in the Joint Premiership Proposal of 1961. There were attempts with the Nkrumah people and so on to get Burnham and Jagan together. That didn't succeed. And so we get to 1964 with the coalition government. But I think what I'm driving at here is that while Guyana and Bagwan himself had meetings with others searching for this joint government, while Guyana and Bagwan coming at the same issue of coalition and power sharing. They're coming at it from outside control and management of the state. And that Burnham is premier, and he has to address this issue within the context of having to manage the state immediately after an ethnic civil war. All right, and so I want to take you back there, because I think we all, you, Dwayne, myself, all of us scholars and activists, always search for this way of kind of explaining our reality. And as I said, I think a lot of times we err on the side of our homogeneity rather than our heterogeneity, and not see the things as parts of a puzzle, you know, that Burnham has to deal with managing a state immediately after an ethnic civil war. The choirs and the Bagwans are engaging the issue of nation building, but they're engaging it outside of management of the state. Vincent Alexander, talk to me.
I think that one has to recognize that Burnham himself was of a particular ethnic group. I think one has to recognize that. So even as quote unquote a statesman, he was of a particular ethnic group. And not only did he emerge from the period you're referring to, but he emerged from the political movement in terms of being a part of the PPP, coming out of the PPP, and therefore having an appreciation of the ethnic problem that we were faced with, but at the same time being an African Guyanese. And recognizing that as an African Guyanese, he had to be careful not to come over as looking after the solely or separately the interests of African Guyanese. Because if in fact he was going to be nation building, he had to find a way to bring into that movement all Guyanese. So that whilst people like Guyana and Bagwan could clearly identify the ethnic problem and a solution to the ethnic problem, Burnham identified the ethnic problem, but the solution to nation building in the face of the ethnic problem, even though he himself may have had a disposition in relation to the ethnic problem. And in that regard, I would have said in the past and would repeat that Burnham sought to address the ethnic problem with an relatively even hand, understanding the imbalances in the society from an economic and other perspective, and therefore was very, I would say, covert in attempting to address that problem from the standpoint of recognizing what he ought to be doing, on one hand for nation building, but on the other hand for the people of African descent. And so his approach was, on one hand, I would say covert, And on the other hand, though he recognized the problem of diversity existed, he sought to create an environment which suggested that in some regards, this problem was man-made, and therefore could be dealt with from a perspective other than that man-made, the political elements that would have brought the problem into existence. Because we have to see what is it that brought this problem into existence. We are naturally a plural society, and therefore naturally the state is challenged to deal with the different groups in a manner that does not suggest that they're being discriminated against. The state has that challenge. But at the same time, if we are going to build a nation, the state has to address the diversity. And so that's a kind of a conundrum. How do I, on one hand, address the diversity, recognizing this is a human rights issue, but at the same time, have an equitable approach that would provide for a kind of a leveling out across the ethnic groups and a zooming in on the commonalities that can bind us, as opposed to the diverse elements that could divide us. So I think it was a difficult situation for him. One cannot exclude his own being, the history of the PPP, the history of the struggle for independence and all of that, the way in which the groups seem to, though naturally we have a plural society, the way in which the plurality was emphasized by the political struggle, the breakup of the party in the first instance, though the breakup itself was not because of the plurality at the level of ethnicity. I would contend the breakup was because of the plurality, the level of ideology. But even as that breakup occurred at the leadership level, based on ideology, simultaneously it took on ethnic connotations, because the very coming together of Burnham and Guyana, when they came together, was a recognition of the need for some kind of togetherness of diverse people if we were to progress. And so we know, we start off recognizing this is a problem that has to be solved. We end up with a problem that divides us, but as that problem divides us, it turns back to a ground level where the people themselves are manifestly plural, while the leadership attempted not to be plural in the first instance. And now you have a situation where part of the plurality is in government, but seeking to progress in a manner that would overcome the negative elements of that plurality and embrace the positive elements for nation building.
And that is where I want Dwayne Benjamin to take us. Dwayne, Burnham he sets out in his own words to use the government and the state to tackle this problem that is rooted in our colonial past and in what he saw as a deliberately attitude on the part of the PPP laterally. But he's attempting to do so within the context of a winner-take-all system. Yes, he is leading a coalition government, but as Vincent said, it's only part of the plurality in that coalition. Basically, it's a government that represents African people. When I say represent, I'm talking about the people who voted for the coalition partners. Amerindian people and sections of the Portuguese and East Indian urban thing, but generally Africans and Amerindians in a mass way are presented that coalition. So that coalition is limited. So in a sense, Burnham is setting himself this task of bringing together this plurality that Vincent is talking about within the context of a winner-take-all system that in many regards, unless you're putting together this grand coalition, you're always going to be up against it. Talk a little bit about that dilemma, Dwayne.
Yes, you're actually right in the sense that forming a government in a winner-take-all system would have been difficult from the very set go. And as much we talk about the problems that Burnham faced in terms of the internal challenges, so far our discussions seems to have isolated the external problems.
No. We are going to get to the external.
Right.
We want to make sure because part of the premise of this program is that sometimes we don't deal with the difficult part of it, and the heterogeneous nature of our society is very difficult because it's a barrier to nation building. It's a problem that we never seem to be able to solve. And then when we go to the external and we go to ideology, and in a sense we are sidestepping this fundamental issue. So so that Burnham attempted to tackle the problem firstly by finding a common ideological basis for the organization society, one of which he defined as cooperative socialism. And if we go back to the idea of cooperative socialism, it's coming out of the idea of cooperatives and the spirits of togetherness that manifests itself throughout our history, coming back from the village movements, the working class movements, etc., and build upon that veteran principle that give us a national ethos or way of organizing our society. But it went beyond that. He pushed the idea of self-sufficiency as a way of bringing people together. The idea of the small man is about creating institutions that create opportunities for all Guyanese, regardless of ethnic group. And I think that much of the debate about the success or not so success of those is based on coming from the ethnic background or coming from whatever political background. But the point is that there's hardly any evidence to show that the government deliberately or in any systematic way did anything that would prevent Guyanese or people from different groups from participating in the process of nation building. Of course, there were challenges in that, and one of the things we have to recognize, as much as we speak about Burnham and much as that we advocate for Burnham's, some of the good things about Burnham is that we were dealing with someone who's a human being, and he wasn't perfect. And in that, there were some elements of extremes in government. Now, we have to understand that dealing or building a nation through the state in a society that is divided along ethnic lines is a very challenging thing. And while we would expect the state to be somewhat multicultural in its approach, in most cases, if we look at the examples outside of Guyana, the state eventually became part of that ethnic problem. And Burnham himself became part of that problem by virtue of simply being an Afro-Guyanese. Not necessarily. And I think that's a fundamental issue that you've raised there. And I want to bring Vincent in on that, because you look at Burnham, you look at Nkrumah, you look at Nyerere, you look at all of them were dealing with these plural societies. In the case of the African leaders, they're really dealing with a cultural plurality, what we call tribalism.
Yes.
You look at a place like India, where the problem manifests itself at the level of religion. And so, as you said, Burnham reaches for a non-racial positioning of the government. And so he reaches for Marxism. He reaches for socialism, as Nkrumah did, as Nyerere did, as all of them did. They reach for that. But and then you talk about extremes. And Vincent, I want you to help us out here. Because people like myself accuse the Burnham government and actively oppose, critique the Burnham government on the level of silencing of dissent and authoritarian governance. And I'm trying to look back here to say, is this ethnic problem itself, is it related, or does it have a role in what and I'm using Dwayne Benjamin's terminology here, the extremes that some of these leaders reach for? Are we overplaying it when we talk about the authoritarian personality? I'm not talking about the difficulties in governing difficult and complex societies that could itself lead, because I always say, Burnham had to deal with a kind of ethnic pushback from the PPP. Because the PPP challenged the Burnham for all its Marxism and so on. There wasn't very much difference there in terms of ideology. I think the push from the PPP was ethnic. And then you get now from this tendency, the Guyana-Bagwan tendency, is I think pushing Burnham and the Caribbean state from a radical ideological position, And so therefore, you're Nkrumah, you are Nyerere, you are Burnham, you are Manley, and then you're Eric Williams. You are dealing with, in this milieu, in which you are challenged ethnically, you are challenged from a radical standpoint. Burnham is a radical. If he were not in government, he would have been doing the same thing that Rodney was doing. He comes out of that tradition. Eric Williams, for God's sake, wrote Capitalism and Slavery. And so, Vincent, talk to me. I know I'm putting you on the spot. Talk to me about...
No, I want to introduce a term here.
Yes.
In that speech which you played, Burnham made it clear that he was going to be speaking to bodies of people who represented different interests. He was going to be speaking, he said, to the Hindus, the Muslims, the Christians. So he's going to be speaking to this set of diverse...
Because you mentioned Askria.
Diverse forces. Now, in speaking to those forces, you can see him attempting to do what I may refer to as a kind of a paternalistic approach to leadership, a kind of paternalism. But inevitably, a paternalism lends to a kind of an authoritarian relationship. So that I'm going to consult with you guys, but I'm not consulting with you guys for you to take me in various directions. I'm going to consult with you guys to pull you together. And that is where the strong arm in some regards comes out. That has its own problem because even among the people with whom he will be speaking, they are fractured politically. So you take the Hindu society and you see that you have emerging factions, some of whom are sympathetic to Burnham, some of whom are not sympathetic to Burnham. And so to pull them together as one Hindu set of people in this context of paternalism, the kind of the strong hand comes in some regards, so that a solution to the problem itself lends to a particular kind of approach to leadership. To leadership, you just can't let everything be at the will and the fancy of individual people, individual groups. You'll never achieve what you want to achieve if that were the case. So you have to find some way to create strictures. And I think that is what Burnham, in some regards, though he reached out to the various groups, he attempted to create the strictures that would bring them into a conglomeration. And in that regard, he was faced with the political problem because he's reaching out now to civil society to counter the problem he is faced with in the political arena. But those to whom he's reaching out are equally being approached by the other element of the political arena. And so if he does not create a situation where they get to understand that he is in power, and if they don't collaborate and work with him, it could be to their detriment. And therefore he has to behave in a particular way for that message to go out there. And in that context, to have people decide, well, I'm going to work with this guy. And the fact of the matter is that to a very large extent, much of the society outside of the political resistance, in the first instance, became passive. He was able to pacify in the first instance. And what he also did in this paternalistic approach was to seek to give some recognition to elements that were not naturally a part of his movement. And so, for example, notwithstanding the strictures that I'm talking about, you could see how he dealt with the Gau. Eventually, he gave recognition to Gau. And in that regard, he's saying to them, but I am your man. I'm your man, they are not. But in all of this, he continues to confront the political opposition that's there, that's not a part of the movement that he's trying to bring about. Because clearly after the first split, and even more particularly after the second split, and I agree that there were two splits, you had camps. And these camps were not exposed to searching for a solution outside of their own political domination. And that posed the problem. If the guys you were talking about, Guyana and Bagwan, were into the drive of probably not political domination, but the political parties and Burnham himself were still in that drive of political domination. And so that's an inherent problem that he himself was faced with.
Dwayne Benjamin, you were the one who pushed us here. Any additional thoughts on this dilemma of and I think Vincent puts it right, in trying to solve the problem, you are in effect running into a problem. Burnham was and I was struck by that in the speech. He was very clear about the role of the state, and he said, we shall be upholding the rule of law, and anyone who attempts to disrupt the rule of law. I was very struck, and I said, this chap, he was 41 years old at the time, so he was an old man, but he had a sense of statecraft and the role of the state that I found unbelievable. Anyhow, go ahead.
Well, that is so, and we have to look at Burnham in the time in which he emerged.
Yes.
A lot of his early education during the 1940s, he would have been seeing strong states and strong governments, and even the
explain what you mean by strong states and strong.
Strong. Well, when I say strong states, strong states and government, what I mean is that basically you see the kind of authoritarianism that we condemn him for would have been manifested.
And Vincent is calling it paternalism, but we know what we're talking about. Right.
So it manifested elsewhere. He lived through that environment. The era of the strong men and dictators and what he lived through that.
And the role of the charismatic leader.
Right. Yes, charismatic leader, but I mean, charismatic leader may have a different connotation, right? So yes, he lived through that time, and he's coming into society at the hem of a government where those very authoritarian systems are passed from previous history, from colonialism. He inherited that. So it's not a case where Burnham did not invent the wheel. But I think what we have to also see Burnham as a nationalist leader, right? And I think there's a difference between him and, let's say, for example, Dr. Jagan. Dr. Burnham was a nationalist, and that
explain what you mean by nationalist, because that could mean many
basically things. I'm talking about somebody who puts who basically in all that his thinking and all that he's doing is basically trying to put Guyana first.
And you're saying that Jagan didn't do that? You're saying that Jagan didn't put Guyana first?
Ideologically, no. I don't think he was interested in I don't even think he was interested in, he didn't demonstrate much to the extent that he was interested in unifying Guyana. One of the things Burnham was doing also is redistributing wealth for Guyanese. And again, if you look where he was coming from, an environment where essentially the upper echelons of the society were the people who were associated, the upper echelons of the bauxite industry, the sugar industry, and much of those large corporations were foreign expatriates who controlled, as one estimate put it, 5% of the population, but controlled a significant portion of the wealth. And of course, that would have been coming back through the colonial period with the planter class and the domination of the working class and so on. So it's something that he inherited and something he attempted to find a solution for. And one of the solutions was redistributing wealth. How did he attempt to do that? Create opportunities, create what he called an egalitarian society or equal opportunity society for us.
But Brother Dwayne, the Indian masses are not seeing that as egalitarian. And that is why I want you to be very careful when you say that he was a nationalist and Jagan was a nationalist. But Jagan's nationalism was grounded in his Indian nationalism. You know, Burnham's, I would argue, nationalism comes out, and I think that's what you're saying. So I'm not telling you you're wrong, that Burnham's gaze was much more Caribbean, much more in that sense. Jagan's was internationalist, but international communist. Burnham is much more regionalist, and that's why the second split on the question of the federation is fundamental. in understanding the nationalisms of both. So I just want to ensure that you're not saying that Jagan was not nationalist, but Jagan's nationalism came from a different place than Burnham's. Jagan wasn't a Hindu. Burnham was a Christian, and as you were saying, he studied in England, and he understood liberal democracy, and he was very conscious as a dark-skinned African, and as an architect of Caribbean regionalism. I think because of the length of time Africans spend there, in a sense, they become Creole and Vincent would appreciate that. They become Creole, they became more West Indian or quicker as West Indian than the Indian did. And so Burnham obviously steeped in that. So I just don't want people to accuse you tomorrow of saying that Jagan wasn't a nationalist, because I don't think that's what you're saying. You're saying that Burnham's nationalism came from a particular place. Go ahead.
Right. So that's what I'm saying, basically. Yeah.
David, allow me to jump in here.
Yes.
And to get back to a major question that you have raised, the question of statism. In Burnham's pursuit of nation building, so to speak, the instrument at his disposal was the state. You have a plural society where people have different values, different morals, they're diverse. What the state does is the state is a mechanism for legitimately putting people under one rule. That's what the state in some regards is.
Mm-hmm.
Because the legal system, though it may seek to facilitate diversity, it's a legal system that speaks to each and every citizen, from some equal basis. And so that Burnham had to use the state as well, and largely use the state to assert his authority, to assert that he was in charge. Because if we are talking about a state, we're talking about a legal system which people have to adhere to. Now, we know if you talk in Marxist terms, and so you can look at the legal system from the standpoint of class and discrimination and all of that. But that notwithstanding, it is something that seeks to create a oneness, even if it is not something people voluntarily subscribe to. It seeks to create a oneness, and a oneness which has some legitimacy, because that's the way in which these liberal societies and societies at large are operationalized. And so the framework in which he was using was a framework which could allow him to say, look, this is what the rule of law, get back to that, the rule of law, this is what we have subscribed to as a state, and I'm in charge of the state. And if the state creates certain rules and certain regulations, then it's applicable to all. Now, in that context, again, you have to push back, because there are those who would say, well, there's a difference between being in government and being legitimate. And legitimacy challenges the state sometimes by saying, yes, you have done that, we subjected it, but it's not right. And the question of different morals and different values step in. But obviously, what he was doing was in the framework of the state. And I go back to my question of paternalism, contending that, I'm reaching out to all of you guys. When I pass a law, sometimes this law is based on speaking to you and representing your interests. So I pass a law that allows for diverse groups to have holidays. My state is a good state. My state is a good state. I bring about free education. My state is a good state. What is it you have? What problem can you have with my state? But the fact of the matter is, the state is a mechanism, in some regards, for imposition.
For imposition. Dwayne, let me come back to you, because Burnham is, by 1974, he says, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. Jagan is a communist. The WPA is saying we are independent socialists, independent Marxists. So there seem not to be any difference in terms of using the state to empower poor people. They agree on it. They agree on nationalism, which meant that if Jagan were in power, he would nationalize, he would do what Burnham did. If Guyana and Rodney and them were in power, they would do the same thing. They probably would have taken it to another pick because they were quote-unquote radicals. But there seemed to be not any disagreement on the use of the state, on the policies of Burnham, because at one time Jagan gave critical support. So I think at that level, the problem is not at that level. I'm going back to Burnham's inaugural speech in '64, where I think he put his finger on the problem. Yes.
Let me jump in here with you. Yes. I don't agree with you that the problem is not this, that level does not have a problem.
All right, go ahead.
Because whilst across the leadership, there was a similar disposition, on the ground, the disposition is not similar.
Right.
So that how does the Indo-Guyanese see state control of economic affairs?
Yes.
Right? And so even as there is this agreement, ideologically, you could still see the way in which the PPP responds to not nationalization, but the management of nationalization, the management of Denver, for example.
Yes.
They bring in the ethnic element.
Yes.
So that they're able to maintain their connectivity with the people. From an ethnic perspective, although there is this pretext that they don't have a problem from an economic perspective. So the diversity, you always have to recognize that this diversity we're talking about is a natural diversity that is evident on the ground. There is no that the diversity on the ground is used. It's used, but it is natural, right? Whether the politician wants it or not, it is there. It adheres in our different evolutions, so that Burnham has to manage a problem where, even though there is commonality about how we fashion the economy and all of that, he has to find a contradiction in how it is actually being managed. That allows him to continue his ethnic control in the context of the natural wronglaying of the people. And one sees after the second split, for example, the way in which Jagan starts to speak about the progressive bourgeoisie, which allowed for him to reach out to the Indian community. And so ethnicity is always featuring in every element of what's happening, although it is not necessarily articulated.
Yes. So Dwayne Benjamin, I thanks Vincent for bringing me back to earth. So Dwayne Benjamin, I think that's what you are saying, that there's a way in which ethnicity influences Jagan's nationalism and his socialism. and that Burnham, given the fact that he's in government, that he has to be more mindful of what Vincent is saying, concealing or not being overt about ethnic preferences and so forth. Go ahead.
Right. So you put it over much better than I was going to say it. Right. And in that, I mean, you find that as much as he tried, he faced the same problem. Keep recurring. He faced the same challenge, the same ethnic problems, and that affected the government in many ways. And if you look at one of his policies, the FCH plan, that would be criticized a lot by the opposition at the time, which is the PPP, and even more contentious after the 1973 election. So yes, the challenges remain despite the fact, and I think that look. The reality is Guyana, if you look at countries that were in a similar position to us at the independence, a lot of those countries went down into civil wars that lasted quite a number of years. Guyana was spared that. And I think that we must give credit to not only to Burnham and his pragmatism, but also to some extent, we must give credit to Dr. Jigan for that also. Yeah,
Dwayne Benjamin here tonight. We're talking about Burnham, and it's a different kind of conversation about Burnham. You know, I always, as I would tell you all on this program, I really don't want to hear how much Bridge Burnham the bill and how much road the bill, because these vagabonds that we have in power building more bridges and roads and so on than Burnham ever did. And so I want to take the conversation beyond. And I asked the question, I'm going to ask these two gentlemen here tonight. Burnham did build roads and he did build bridges, some of which are lasting symbols in our society, whether it's the Linden-Soestdijk Highway, whether it is the Harbor Bridge that they've just confiscated. These are infrastructure that he built. What I am interested in is not the infrastructure, but the thinking, the thought process, the outcomes. What is driving Burnham's infrastructure? Because I think you all Burnhamites have to distinguish between Burnham's infrastructure and the infrastructure now, because clearly the PPP is linking their quote-unquote development on infrastructure. So when Burnham might say, well, Burnham build bridge, Burnham build, you risk falling into that thing. And so what I want you all to do here for me is to put in context for this audience, what is the social thinking behind Burnham infrastructural program? Is emphasis on education, because that was very, very, very key. You and I, Vincent, you, Dwayne Benjamin, myself, we're all products of Burnham's education thrust. Do for me, put it in social context and not necessarily the Ibila Bridge and Ibila Highway. I start with you, Vincent.
I want to make a couple of points.
Yes.
Let me contend that for all intents and purposes, Burnham was a Creole.
All right.
And one of the problems Guyana's faced with is that Indian leadership has resisted Creolization. Indian leadership has resisted Creolization. Even Chedi under his communism resisted Creolization. If you look carefully at the conduct of the struggle, it was a their struggle against colonialism also had integral to it a pushback from a cultural perspective that pushed back on the natural process of Creolization. Right? So that the value systems that drive the PPP are different than the value systems that drove Burnham. the value systems that drive in the main people of Indian descent are different from the value systems that drive people of African descent. And so if you have governments which are dominated by one or the other group, then there's also the issue of a particular value system dominated. Now, African Guyanese were enslaved and had to find their way after abolition, had to find their way. Indo-Guyanese came as indentured, it might have been oppressive, but they never lost their way. They came with a particular objective, and that objective was for materially a better standard of living than they were experiencing in India. We didn't have that kind of juxtaposing. We came from ground zero. They did not come from ground zero. They landed at a particular level and continued along that path. As a creolized set of people, we have adopted largely Western approach to life. Largely the Western approach to life. Whilst one may argue that the Indo-Guyanese are in business and that is Western, that is a means. That is not their way of life. That's a means to facilitate what is it that they wanted. And so, from a standpoint of government, what drives the Indo-Guyanese at this time, who are largely led in a hierarchical structure? We can't ignore that, in a hierarchical structure, where pro-business, making money is what drives them, as opposed to a more welfareist kind of humane kind of African Guyanese who's emerged out of enslavement. This is something I don't think that will be easily taken. I'm getting to an area here that's going to have a lot of comeback.
Yes.
But it's the reality that we have to come to terms with, that our diversity has some elements which do not easily lend to cohesion. And it's only the status and, in some regards, the Western or creolized approach that seeks to impose a oneness, which is not necessarily acceptable. And so, when Burnham pursues infrastructure, he's pursuing infrastructure in the Western liberal context of development. When the PDP pursuing infrastructure, they try to articulate it that way, but they are driven largely by a desire to put wealth at their disposal. And infrastructure, in a circumstance where they are the contractors, largely puts wealth at their disposal. So you might have a coincidence which says, look, well, we are building infrastructure and the nation's benefit. But it is largely driven by policies that are pro-business and not pro-people. Burnham infrastructure was pro-people, though it did not interfere with business, except that his socialism interfered with business. And so we must remember something. If we go back into the archives, we will see the PPP criticized Burnham's government for spending too much money on infrastructure. That's a part of our history. If you go and check the budget speeches and all of that, they criticize Burnham for spending too much infrastructure. But look what they are now doing in terms of infrastructure. But when Burnham spent on infrastructure, not only did he do it from a liberal economic perspective of national development, but he also did it from the perspective of people's development, because he sought as far as possible to have what they call the petty bourgeoisie and cooperatives and the ordinary man, the beneficiaries of the infrastructure from two perspectives, from the perspective of infrastructure itself, but from the perspective of livelihood. Presently, the ordinary man not benefiting from infrastructure from the perspective of livelihood. It is the pro-business people who are benefiting from infrastructure from the standpoint of livelihood. I think this is a difficult discussion to have, but it's one which is necessary, because we have to be able to identify the antagonistic and divergent elements of our diversity, even as we look towards the convergent elements for the purpose of nation building.
Dwayne Benjamin.
Yes, I've listened to Mr. Alexander, and I kind of want to disagree with the whole idea of this liberal Western style development, and to say that Burnham's infrastructure expenditure was along that line. Because if we take a look at some of the major infrastructure projects, the MMA Abari schemes, even the highway, the Linden Suicide Highway, the Demwara Harbor Bridge, is connecting people. This is connecting people and giving access, giving the cooperative movement access for the produce and goods to be able to move. And I think that's where a lot of his focus was. And I think that it is part very much the socialist approach to development, the socialist central plan development approach, as well as investing in the human resource development. And I think if we look at, while he was condemned to spend a lot of it on the infrastructure is very small compared to the expenditures on health and education. And once we expand on health and education, of course, we're talking about investing in people. So much of what we talk about people-centered development, Burnham started that very early after independence. And a lot of the infrastructures include building schools, hospitals, communities, etc. And this is not just about roads and bridges, but we're talking about the housing programs and government-aided housing programs. All of these were basically aimed at empowering people. Because I think one of the things that was recognized very early is that for Guyana to develop, a lot of the development wasn't with the infrastructure, but need investment with the people. And I think Mr. Alexander would know very well that one of the first things Burnham did when he went into power in 1964 was did a manpower audit, where he recognized where out of that audit, it was recognized that certain skills were lacking in the country. Identify the skills gaps, basically. So that a lot of that influenced his thinking beyond just building roads and bridges. And I think that is what captured the essence of his infrastructure projects, production for need, and not necessarily the liberal capitalist approach to.
But I don't think you all are saying, because there is a liberal democracy that is capitalist, and I don't think that's a liberal democracy that Vincent is talking about, because there's a liberal democracy was very influenced by socialism. Social democracy, even among the Marxists, you go back to Rosa Luxemburg and so on. So I don't think you are saying it different from Vincent. You think that Vincent is talking about capitalism?
I just think I think
he's talking more about the supplies and socialism.
I think the terminology could be a bit misleading to say that someone who from 1970 onwards said that tell the world that we're cooperative socialists, but you have infrastructure that is liberal Western style. It's kind of contradicting. So yeah.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that Western liberal democracy itself is divided between the capitalist liberal democracy and the more socialist leading democracy, the one that the Scandinavian countries use, the one that we in the English-speaking Caribbean as generally embraces, a different kind of social democracy from the United States.
Yeah.
But Mr. Alexander, go ahead if you want to.
No, well, I think, David, you have come to my rescue in some regards in articulating where I was going, because indeed, your examples of the Scandinavian countries and all of that, because it is true that what Burnham did in terms of infrastructure was focused on people's development. If one talks about the growth pole approach to development, which talks about infrastructure, you can see that in that growth pole approach, where Burnham did infrastructure, it was not infrastructure that simply facilitated business. It was infrastructure aimed at giving the ordinary man an intake into business. So when, for example, he built the fish ports, right? And he built them and he said, this is specifically for cooperatives to use. It was infrastructure, it's growth pole infrastructure, but it is not the open market, in kind of approach to infrastructure that you will find in some of the Western countries. So what I beg for is an understanding of what I'm saying, rather than a distancing.
Look, we have done, you got to understand that by 1970, the growth pole understanding development was replaced by the people-centered development. By 1970. So if we analyzing Burnham in that context, we have to be very careful about that.
I would argue that the growth pole is not necessarily not people-centered. And that's the point I'm making when I talked about the fish ports. It's growth pole, but it's people-centered at the same time. But one has to admit, however, that in terms of the approach to development, that Burnham's approach was, he called it trisectoral, because it embraced the growth pole, it embraced centralism, as much as it embraced the community approach. So it was not singular growth pole. But I'm using that argument in the growth pole in the context of juxtaposing Burnham to the PPP. So you have to contextualize in some regards.
Well, it's on that basis I'm trying to say that we need to be a bit careful because
But let's move on because time is moving on. Let's come to the present. Vincent, you very instrumental in the formation of the Burnham Foundation. Dwayne, I know that you have some relationship with the foundation. And 41 years after Burnham's death, as you all move around the country and engage people, in particular the ethnic support base of Burnham's party, African Guyanese, is Burnham recognizable as a name, as a phenomenon in the communities?
I would put it this way.
Yeah.
That there's a resurgence of the recognition of Burnham. Where there's a deficiency, it's among the younger generation, because the communication infrastructure is used in such a manner as to demonize him and or to omit him from the narrative. but there is a resurgence among people who might have fallen off the radar in relation to Burnham. And that resurgence has a lot to do with two things. It has a lot to do with the fact that people can see that things that Burnham originated are being brought back into the home under new brands. And people can recognize that. Additionally, the nationalism, the dignity of the Guyanese person, people are recognizing that the Burnham period lent more to that, so that they, in their own awakening of where they're at, are saying, you know what? We were better off as Guyanese in terms of our Guyanese personality, in terms of respect and self-esteem and things like that. So there is a resurgence, but there is that problem that the younger generation, because of the communication technology and communication strategies and so in the country, are not necessarily being exposed to that history and those realities, and so sometimes are adrift.
The same question for you, Dwayne, but I want you to factor in the role of the political party, in this case, the People's National Congress, in keeping Burnham's legacy alive, in witnessing for Burnham. Implicit in my question is whether the political party is an effective instrument in keeping alive the legacy of their leaders, or whether in fact that is the kind of task that lies outside of the political party. I think I'm asking you a couple of questions there.
Yes, you asked me a lot of questions. Those are serious questions, and questions that I think we have to have a straight and honest discussion around. The first thing I'm going to say is that currently there's a need for more organizations like the Burnham Foundation. In fact, I think the Burnham Foundation should be challenged to do more in terms of what it's doing and reach a wider audience. That's one. When you go around this country, and I think that this is one of the good things about Guyana, is that the name Burnham as well as Dr. Jigan still resonates in people's mind. Despite the fact, and I think Mr. Alexander pointed that out, is that you're going to have a generation of Guyanese in the next couple of years growing up don't even know what was the Demoara Harbor Bridge. They probably know the Barjagdio Demoara River Bridge. Some people might say that's a consequence of time, it's a consequence of modernization, whatever. But there's a challenge for us to preserve our history and to tell our story, and tell our story as far and wide as possible. And that's one of the challenges for us. Where the political parties are concerned, and more specifically, I think you're asking me about one particular political organization. I think because of the fact that that particular political organization had been ruptured between Burnham and the Desmond Hoyt kind of thing, where you have essentially the left wing versus the right wing element at the party, and that has been an ongoing back and forth discussion in the party. And I think the party itself is becoming overwhelmed by that discussion. So I think it's time at some point, I think they might see the need for chart a new course. What the new course looks like, I don't know. But what I know for sure is that on the ground, there's a call to the party to return to fundamentals. And by returning fundamentals, people are arguing that the party should return to its foundation, to its base. And of course, once we talk foundation base, there's a drive basically for the party to return to some of the values and some of the strategies that Burnham would have employed. I don't know how well that would work in the 21st century. It's left to be seen. But of course, the 21st century also poses new methods, new challenge, new ways of doing things. And at some point, you have to embrace.
Vincent, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I agree with. I think that Dwayne is on point when he mentioned the Hoyt period. I think that there was a fracturing and a rupturing of the continuity of Burnham in many ways, including even memorializing and commemorating his legacy. And that is one of the reasons for where we are at. I think also that in terms of the party, that there was a period where the growth was more lateral than vertical, meaning that it took in people who were not on the axis, the Burnham axis, and therefore may be contaminated by, it's an unkind word, but may be contaminated by that reality of the lateral movement, which Hoyt in many regards fostered. I do think that the party, there's a question of the internal party structure and its membership, given direction to where it ought to be going from that ideological perspective. I think the party got caught up in the period of not wanting to talk about ideology, and it's true that the word ideology doesn't resonate a lot these days, but certainly there can be articulations which are ideological without talking about ideology. I think in some regards, the Norton regime has sought, by virtue of talking about people-centered development, to take that party back into that direction. But whether he has the structures to re-implant that on the ground may still be the question.
Vincent Alexander and Dwayne Benjamin here tonight, and I notice you all have stayed with the conversation, although it's not the normal kind of Burnham conversation that we normally have, and I don't make any excuses or apologies for taking these conversations in a certain direction, because I think that as post-plantation societies, we have gone through the strictures, ideological, ethnic strictures of the first 50, 60 years of independence. They've been really difficult period. And I think any society has to refresh itself. I think all of us, whether we are PPP, PNC, WPA, whatever, we have to come to grips with what our nations have presented us with. Burnham didn't fall from the sky. Jagan didn't fall from the sky. Rodney, Guyana, none of them didn't fall from the sky. They're products of our society. And I think that if we bring new gazes to our society, we will find ways, better ways, of explaining ourselves and not being afraid of ourselves. The point that Vincent made just now, that they almost fear of talking about ideology within the PNC. They almost fear about talking about race within the PNC in a public way. And it's not confined. I can tell you, in my own WPA family, there probably is much more, we are much more at ease talking about class and ideology, but not of race, which may surprise a lot of people. And so I'm saying, as a national project, we have to speak about the wholeness of the society and hope that that filters down down to people. I mean, I taught in America for more than 3 decades at the university level. And when those people talk about their founding fathers, you won't even believe they had ideological differences, deep ideological differences, those white men who founded that nation. But I've always marveled at how America has been able to present them as founding fathers, as if they were no difference. There are fundamental differences. I mean, the Bill of Rights came as a result of deep differences. In fact, it came down to 10 articles in that Bill of Rights, but there were 80-something of them. So sharp were the differences. And so I think that is a point that we have to get to in Guyana, where we should be comfortable really discussing our past. They've been painful past, and they had to be, because we came out of slavery and didn't have time to breathe, developed villages, and started to have to deal with colonialism in a different way. Indentureship came. We became independent after the Second World War, jump into the Cold War. We are coming into being in the context of a world that wasn't made for us. And so in many ways, there's some discussions, I think, as a society we never had. You know, the British chap out here, king head and all kind of thing on their way, you know, figuring out the economic system and the political system and so on. We have not had time to really sit down. And so I am deliberate about these conversations. I'm not going to be charged, well, David, why you didn't ask them about whether Burnham was a dictator? I am not interested in that discussion at this point. I've been very I don't think that helps Black people, and I don't think it helps race relations in the country. It's there, and I will talk about that among fellow travelers. But if we are trying to deal with what I see as this threatening cloud that is being visited upon us by a PPP-injected domination and ethnic domination and nationalism, the coming of oil, which means that the planters have come back. And if we're going to grapple, if we're not going to wake up tomorrow, where 750,000 Indians and Africans realize that the country don't belong to them no more. And that's a serious threat. And, you know, as an African Guyanese, I have to be more concerned about it, because Indian Guyanese may be able to engage that world to a certain level. I don't think Amerindians and Africans are going to be able to. And so therefore there's a certain kind of conversation. I will have to do as the Calypsonian Black Stallion said, wait, Dorothy, wait. I'm not saying that that conversation is not necessary, but I think that conversation is more injurious to African Guyanese at this time. And so therefore I am interested in another conversation. And it's that kind of conversation that I think we have attempted to have here tonight. Some people may have wanted more Burnham red meat. Some people may have, like I said, may have wanted more anti-Burnham red meat. I'm not interested in that at this juncture. Wait, Dorothy, wait. Closing thoughts. Dwayne and then Vincent.
I think it's very good, as you rightfully said, very good to have these conversations. I think we should have much more of these conversations on our leaders of the past and how they influence or shape our societies.
Short and crisp.
I have found that there has been a timidity in our attempt sometimes to have this kind of conversation. And I'm referring to the Burnham Foundation itself. There's been some timidity. There are those who, that's not what they're into, period. They don't, when you get into that kind of conversation, they see it even as being anti-Burnham. But I do indeed believe that there's a need for that kind of conversation from the Burnham perspective. I have talked about a project of the de-demonizing of Burnham, which for me really means contextualizing Burnham. And that contextualizing will allow you to be critical of Burnham, but in context, understanding in the final analysis its interest as a nation building.
Vincent Alexander, regular Dwayne, you must come back more often. Nice having you guys, and like I said, for me, it's the kind of discussion that I'm interested in. Thank you all very much for coming on. And for you, the audience, thanks for being patient. As my friend Turkey said, man, at times you got to talk more about what happening today. And look, I'm a political person. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, we have always been called upon in countries like ours to multitask. So that one is the political activist or politician. One is also the teacher. One is also the analyst. And they're all wrapped up together. So there's some nights I can't do the red meat. You're sick in the stomach if I gotta do red meat every night. So I'm begging you, Turkey, be a little patient with me. I got to do Moses back one sometimes. You know, I got to do Burnham sometimes. I got to do Jagan sometimes. I got to do history. You know, I was remarking to my comrades, I think today, that I am not a trained historian. I'm a trained political scientist. But everywhere I go around this country, people refer to me as a historian. And I stopped resisting it. I stopped telling people I'm not a historian because I think it's insulting to them. Because in their minds, I am a historian. And I think that is what is important. They feel that I do something with history. I bring history, although I'm not a trained historian, I bring history, and I see that as part of my duty. And in the end, for me, all of that is politics. All of that is politics. I myself like red meat, and sometimes, most times I tune in to my friend Mark, and I get plenty red meat. You know, Mark don't play. Right? I tune into Sherrod when I want a kind of barbecue meat. You know, I tune into Kedaki when you get the meat, where you give the meat cook up in rice and what we call cook up rice. And if we all do the same thing all the time, I don't think we're making some progress, right? And so I ask for patience. We have to have these conversations that we're having here tonight. And I think people of our generation, Vincent's generation and my generation, we owe it to you all, especially on this Burnham thing. I think people like Vincent and myself, coming as we did from two different political perspectives, I think we are two different political, but who are able to work together in a common interest 40 years later, 50 years later. There is something about our example that has to seep down into the community. And that is why we have to have these conversations. I love you all, always, because without that love, we are doing nothing until tomorrow night.